Hey Final Fantasy fans, just want to give you a heads up that this episode will contain spoilers from the entire game of Final Fantasy XVI throughout this episode, as well as spoilers from Final Fantasy XV's episode Arden, around an hour and 38 minutes in, and Final Fantasy XIV's Shadowbringers expansion around the hour 40-minute mark. And with that in mind, welcome to the show.
What was the point? Do you remember Oscar the Squire?
I remember Oscar. He's freaking awesome.
No, he's not awesome. He's almost awesome, and then he's not. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Final Fantasy Files, where we discuss all things Final Fantasy from why did Yuna become a pop star to what happened to Bannon? I'm Jolie Hales.
And I'm Ernest Dion.
And today we're going to continue our discussions about Final Fantasy XVI by discussing lingering questions we had after completing the game, as well as some of the answers we've seen from the interwebs. So potentially some people actually watching this right now. And to do this, Ernest and I have made a list of questions, and these are questions that came up as we were playing the game, and we're just going to go back and forth and take turns discussing these questions and possibly any answers we may have found as well. And I have no idea what Ernest's questions are, and he doesn't know what mine are, so this will be a lot of fun.
That's right. That's the way it should be.
And of course, like every episode, I should probably warn you that this is a spoiler cast, so we will be talking all aspects of the game, and if you don't want to hear spoilers, maybe play the game, come back, and then join us after the fact. All right.
That's right.
Let's do this.
Awesome.
I'll kick it off, shall I?
Yeah, you should start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so question number 1 for me is who beheaded Benedikta?
Wow, that is not one of my questions, so That's impressive. I didn't even think about that until you brought it up right now. But, I mean, Clive had a sword.
You think Clive beheaded her? No. Really?
I mean, who else would have done it?
Okay. You think the hero just chopped her head off?
Well, because remember, like, she went, I don't know, what did they call it? Primed or whatever, where she lost all control. This thing went like supernova, however you want to describe it, going prime, I don't know, whatever. And so the only two that I can think of that are still left alive in the vicinity, or at least left even in the vicinity, because these are like hurricane force winds, right, is Benedikta and Clive. So who else was around when this hurricane finally stopped?
Well, yeah.
That could have been the one that did it.
But don't you think that, I mean, so we see Cid put the pendant on Benedikta and walk away. So we know it's not Cid, and that doesn't seem like something Cid would do. I would also argue that it wouldn't be Clive either, because Clive was probably whisked away, because I doubt he was in very good shape after the Ifrit fight, right, with Benedikta. Also, if you remember back to the fight in Rosalith between Hugo Kupka and Clive, where Kupka actually accuses Clive of decimating her body or something along those lines.
Right, desecrating her body, something like that.
Desecrating, thank you. Yeah, desecrating her body.
And decimating. He did both, so,
yeah,
okay.
But he accuses Clive, and Clive's like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Your master slew Benedikta Harmon and defiled her body. If you choose to bear that murderer's name, then you shall answer for his crimes.
I feel like Clive didn't do it, but I didn't know, because on the game, they don't actually talk about who did it. We see her dead with her head on, and then suddenly her head is in a box to Kupka. So I looked this up online.
Well, hold on. Before you tell me, I'm going to try to take a guess here.
Okay.
So, like, you said Clive has no idea. So you're probably right. I was just making up Clive because he's the only other person there that I can think
of. It's like so anti-Clive character, though, to chop her head off.
So who would send Hugo Kupka the head of his lover or whatever? It would have to be somebody that wanted to anger him so bad,
right,
that he would rage and go after Clive and specifically the hideout, right?
Right.
So who could it possibly be? The number one suspect I would have would be Anabella.
Okay.
Or someone in her orbit.
Oh, she's doing all kinds of terrible things to people, that's for sure.
She's doing all kinds of bad stuff behind the scenes, and she's pretty manipulative, right? So this would be a way to get him to rage and go after Clive, right? Because she's obviously after him. Or it is another thing of either Ultima's lackey, the one that picked up Kupka when his hands were cut off, right?
Sleipnir.
I'll tear you limb from limb!
Peace, Hugo. The table shan't hurt you any longer.
Yeah. So it has to be like somebody trying to anger him to the point where he goes after this guy.
Right. And that's what the internet thinks as well. And that's also my assumption. So I think from what I've read and what I've also just gathered from playing the game, the assumption is that it was Sleipnir / Barnabas / Ultimas. So that little trio or the lackeys, probably Sleipnir more than anything else. So that's what the internet thinks. But there is no moment in the game that actually spells that out enough for people to know. So either they wanted us to make the assumption or they ran out of time and budget to show us how it was done.
You're right. The whole thing was trying to set him off, right? So who had a vested interest in setting off Kupka to go after Clive? Now, remember, this is before they destroyed the first hideout, right? Actually, that's what I think sent him in a rage.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So
that's what made him actually want revenge on Cid at that point. But then Cid dies without Kupka's revenge because Kupka goes after him, which is why he destroys the hideout. And then he's mad at Clive because Clive is the new Cid. And he's like, well, if I can't kill the actual Cid, I'm going to go after you instead.
Yeah. So it has to be one of those.
I will say that because it's not spelled out very much and there's a lot of people online who kind of wanted to know the answer to this question, I think that it's fine as it is. I think we can all kind of guess who did it. But since it is such an important plot point, because her beheading actually leads to Kupka's anger that makes him destroy the hideaway and like puts all these things in motion, because that is such a impactful moment in the story, I think it would have been better to actually visually allude to the fact that it was Sleipnir or whoever it ended up being by like even something as simple as showing Sleipnir's shadow in the background when Benedikta's corpse is laying on the ground, right? Like after Cid walks away. I think that would have been a simple solve.
And what would be the impetus behind Ultima / Barnabas / Barnabas's lackey doing this? Like, why would they want to send Kupka after Clive, I guess is the question.
Well, it's clear when they actually have the Kupka-Clive battle that Sleipnir was hoping for that this whole time. And in order to get Clive to that point and Kupka to that point, they kind of had to orchestrate a reason for Kupka to lose it and get all mad at him. So I don't know exactly what that reason was necessarily, but
the more I go back and think about the game, this is just a guess, right? Remember, Ultima wanted the perfect vessel
with like all the powers
in order to cast his spell
of the icons, perhaps.
So I think it was an orchestration to try to get Kupka's power into Clive.
Right.
I think they were orchestrating this entire thing, sending him down the line of
like getting every icon power
dominance to try to get them all.
Yeah.
Right. So like a Pokemon thing.
Yeah.
So that when he finally got to Ultima, he had already collected all of these powers.
I think you're right. The problem with that I see in the game is that there's multiple times where Ultima or one of the Ultimas, whether it's a part of him or like part of his race or whatever, where they actually attempt to take the vessel early before he has collected all of the icon powers. So that's why that part's a little bit confusing. Like, wait, are you going to take the vessel now? Or are you going to wait till he's got all the powers? Which is why Ultima, the big Ultima, the real one, I guess, should be orchestrating that he takes them all, you know?
Right.
So there's a little confusion there. Anyway, that's the question I had, and I was glad to see that I was not alone and that a lot of people out there had the same question.
So that actually is an excellent segue into one of mine. It's how exactly was Cid's essence handed down to Clive?
It's good to see you, Cid.
He's the first that can take icon powers from others that we know of in the history of dominance on the world, right? So how did he inherit Cid's legacy? That's the question.
So you're talking legacy or icon powers?
Not the icon powers. That part was obvious. They showed us
He's
that.
like, he puts his hand on his chest and he's like, here you go. Then he dies.
What I can't figure out is like, is inheriting Cid's legacy as simple as the guy just started calling himself Cid? Or was there something else that like, I don't know, he inherited or he ingested or whatever that
he like takes a potion and now he's Cid.
Right. That made him the new Cid as opposed to just like, hey, I'm going to take Cid's name because I'm going to carry on his mission.
That's interesting. Okay. So first of all, I would say I'm not in love with him taking Cid's actual name.
You're as stubborn as the old Cid was.
I thought it was a little bit
weird.
Forced, a little bit weird. It's like, no, his name is Clive. just call him Clive and he can still have the same like responsibilities. So I wasn't in love with that, but wasn't a deal breaker or anything like that. The game is still awesome. As far as him taking his legacy, my assumption from a writing perspective is that Clive, after witnessing Cid die and after making a pact that he was going to continue what Cid started, Clive decides to basically take a leadership role, goes back to the hideaway where I assume everybody was just in disarray because it had just been destroyed, right? And he takes that stance where he's like, I made a pact, let's do this, and kind of evolved into the leader of that group. And then they just started calling him Cid for, I don't know what reason. That's kind of, I think it could have been as simple as that. Like he made a pact.
I think so.
He saw Cid die, and now he wanted that legacy to continue since he had fully at that point bought into what Cid was doing.
Right. So when I went trying to find this on the internet, I actually couldn't find it in a Reddit thread, but I did find the article on it's theloadout.com. And it's kind of alluding to what you're saying. This thing was so weird the way it happened, but it says Clive takes the mantle of Cid, the outlaw, in Final Fantasy XVI after his friend, Sidolphus Telamon, dies during a mission to destroy Drake's head, one of the 5 mother crystals. Clive takes the alias to honor Cid's legacy of the hideaway in hopes of saving more bearers and dominance. So
kind of along the same lines.
This is the weird part. Like maybe it's just looking at it from like a Western or modern lens. Like there's plenty of times where someone dies and someone decides they're going to carry on their mission. But I've never heard of somebody taking the other person's name.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
That was the weird part for me.
I didn't really buy that. Like, and I love Cid. Maybe that's part of the reason I don't love that they took his name. It's like, no, there's one Cid, and that was the Cid, the guy that we all loved, right?
I mean, there's also the running joke that like Cid is in almost every Final Fantasy.
Yeah, but he only needs to be in it once.
Right. It's just
right. And I thought, to your point, though, it was cool because Cid's almost always associated with an airship, right?
Right.
Usually an airship pilot. But in this case, he was an airship pilot in such a different way because he wasn't actually a real practical pilot. He was the pilot of a mission. And then there was a new hideaway based around accomplishing that mission that was built out of an airship. So I thought that was really clever. I like that.
Right. It was a ancient or whatever magic-driven airship, right?
Right.
That they took over as their new hideaway. But also his daughter built the actual airship.
Sort of.
Or attempted to.
Yeah, that's a whole other. Someday we're going to talk about mid in an entire episode because I just wanted to see that airship before the credits rolled and they just never did. Maybe DLC, I don't know.
They have to, right? Like if you don't give that to us in DLC, I don't even know what people are going to say.
You did all the side quests, right?
Every single one of them.
You remember how she actually builds the prototype.
Here goes nothing. Titan's tits.
It wasn't supposed to fly, was it?
Of course it was supposed to fly. Wouldn't be much of an airship if it didn't.
And I'm like, oh, just make a few tweaks.
Right.
Genius engineer. And then you can go fly that thing to Origin and help out somehow. You know what I mean? Like that's where my mind went. And then it turns out it's totally off.
It's almost like they had the DLC planned, but they were trying to figure out where that line was, right? Like they had to take you up to the line where it's like, okay, if this thing's a flop and we can't do DLC, then we've given enough of the story that people can walk away with like semi-closure and everyone's happy, right? But they also left some threads open in case they did have a success and they could get the DLC. So I feel like the airship is going to be part of the DLC.
Well, we'll see, because if not, it's,
I hope it is.
a little bit of a letdown there.
So what do you got now?
Okay, so my next question is, why in the world did Joshua wait so long after the tragedy at Phoenix Gate to reveal that he was alive to Clive?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Why did he wait so long? He knew Clive was alive and like basically a slave in the Empire.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The only thing I can think of is that when that whole thing was over, the thing that happened at Phoenix Gate, I'm assuming that Joshua was pretty wrecked after that.
Totally. But he's also also like 8 years old or something.
Right, he was a kid. He went off to heal or something and whatever. And my guess is that he figured something out, or discovered something is probably a better way to put it. And felt like the most important thing was to go figure out why all this was happening, right?
Yep.
Because regardless of what's going on in the world and Clive's situation, and even Jill's for that matter, because like you said, he probably knew all of this, right? If he didn't figure this thing out, it wouldn't matter what else was going right or wrong.
Right. The world would end.
The world would end. So he took that as like his primary mission. And that's why he disappeared and we didn't see him until he was an adult.
Right. So there actually is content that supports what you're saying, because when he goes to see Dion, Dion's like, I need to take care of this other stuff within the kingdom before I can really help you with your Ultima problem. And Joshua's pretty urgent and like, we don't have time to really wait for that.
You will join me in my fight.
I cannot. Not yet.
Your Highness, please.
So, you know, there is definitely a sense of urgency there. And there is a lot of proof throughout the game that Joshua and Yote have made it this mission to do this research and figure out Ultima so that they can save the world before it's too late. But here are some of the answers that I got from the internet. Okay, somebody said Joshua probably didn't want to approach Clive until he had control of Ifrit, since it didn't go very well for him the first time. I don't buy that at all, but I thought that was a kind of a funny answer. Somebody else said the Undying forced them to stay apart. Now, the Undying was that kind of cultish following of the Phoenix. And we find out somewhere in the game that they were the ones who rescued Joshua after Phoenix Gate and nursed him back to health. So we know he's in their care at that point. And so this person thinks that the Undying wouldn't let Joshua go see Clive. Honestly, I don't buy this either, because why would they do that? Because it was dangerous, you know, because the mission was too important. I felt like the Undying were people who would tell him strongly what they wish he would and would not do, but they wouldn't actually stop him from doing something, because he's the one that they all almost worship, right?
Right.
And then somebody also said Joshua didn't know where Clive was. I also don't buy this one. Joshua can literally feel the presence of other icons.
The ether of her icon endures. And as long as it does, we can be certain she is alive.
He's going to know where his brother is, right? He's going to want to know what happened to Clive once he's nursed back to health. I mean, he just lost his father. His mother's a psychopath. The person probably most on his mind from the moment he can consciously think again is probably Clive. That's my thought. And then somebody else said he wanted to keep the part of Ultima sealed in his chest away from Clive at all cost. I think this can be feasible as to why he would avoid Clive once Ultima was sealed in his chest, but not before that point.
Not when he was a child.
Yeah, like not while he was a child, a teenager, not for all those years before the point that he actually seals him in his chest. So I don't buy it in that part of the game. Somebody else put, it took that long to heal from Phoenix Gate. I would also say no, because Joshua goes to the first Mother Crystal and he's in that area and he like purposefully does not interact with Clive. So he's deliberately avoiding him even though he's completely healed. So don't buy that. Somebody else wrote just because he's an a-hole. Which
well, that's a rough one.
I don't think that's the case, though. I don't think that.
No.
Because, like, there are certain characters who are a-holes in Final Fantasy, like Gladio from Final Fantasy 15, I would say, goes on that list in a lot of ways. Not always, but in a lot of ways.
I think that was just stern love.
I get. Yeah, he had stern love, but I thought he was just kind of all about himself, which makes him kind of a douche.
No, like Anabella, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. That's probably a better example, right? But not Joshua, though. So Joshua strikes me as this really loving brother all throughout the story. So there's nothing that says a-hole to me in his character. And then the final answer I got off the internet was Joshua and the Undying were so devoted to their cause, their research on Ultima and how to stop him, that they didn't want anything to detract from their focus. And that's kind of what you were alluding to. And I think that's the most feasible out of the answers I read on the interwebs, but I also think it's kind of lame if that's the reason, because wouldn't Joshua want Clive to join in their research rather than be made a slave and forced to kill for the Empire? To me, it seems like it would make sense to bring him on board.
I think it depends on where they were in the research. See, I don't know when the Undying started this process, right? Like,
Okay.
when did they figure out that they needed to go figure out this thing about Ultima? Was it at Phoenix Gate? Was it before Phoenix Gate? Right? Because the thing is, like, I believe they had to exist before Phoenix Gate, right?
Yes.
Before all of this.
In order to be able to help Joshua.
Maybe they were already deep in this research when this thing happened. And remember, they're going like site to site and they're seeing these drawings on walls and stuff that depict Ifrit risen. And so they're trying to figure out all this stuff themselves, right? So maybe what happened was when the fight happened with Ifrit and Phoenix, perhaps either the Undying didn't realize at that point that it was Clive. And so
maybe they thought he was dead.
They also didn't know. They might have thought that he perished in this whole thing.
Okay.
Or they realized at that point that Clive could be part of the problem. And so try to isolate Joshua from him, at least while he was a little kid.
Yeah, but do you really think that they would be successful in doing that once he's like a teenager?
I think they would up to maybe early adulthood. So my guess is that because he was a little boy still, like 8, 9, 10,
Thank you, Joshua.
they could control him pretty well, right? Because he's a little kid and they saved him. But you're right. At a certain point, he would become more self-aware and kind of figure all this stuff out. And my guess is that someone had a talking with him probably around 15, 16 and said, hey, by the way, we think your brother's still alive. We think he's actually Ifrit. We think he's part of the problem because there's these drawings of him on the walls of these temples, these ancient temples. We don't know what's going on, but it's probably not a good idea that you all interact with each other for a while until we figure this out.
Interesting.
And if Joshua's already old enough to reason and understand, he'd probably say, okay, I get it, right? Let me go figure this thing out, and then we'll have our family reunion or whatever it is.
Okay. I think that that's probably the most feasible argument, but I still think it's not strong enough to account for why he didn't interact with Clive like at the first Mother Crystal, right? When he's there.
Oh, why he hid from him?
Yeah, like why isn't he interacting? Because at that point, he's got the mystery solved, and now he's going to go pursue Dion to try and help get rid of Ultima.
Just try and get to my brother now.
I don't think he had it fully solved. I think he had a good enough portion of it solved. So think about it this way. When that happened and their paths crossed, obviously Joshua could have at any point interacted with him. It was his choice not to.
Right, which I think is totally not feasible. Like, that's my argument, is like, why? There's no reason.
There had to be a reason.
That's you giving the writers credit, right? See, I'm not giving them as much credit as you are because I think the writers are very, very good. But I'm going to be honest. My opinion about the real reason why Joshua stayed away from Clive was because the writers just wanted that big reunion scene to play out as it did.
Oh, that's possible too.
And they hoped that we would just buy into the fact that they're not interacting. Now, they probably wrote some reason in there that's kind of tentative to understand. But to me, that scene, that reunion scene between Joshua and Clive is an awesome scene. It's one of the best scenes in the game.
Joshua!
Clive!
My brother. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You're alive. We both are. Nothing else matters. I never dared hope that I would see this day.
And I also think that one of the reasons that they kept them apart is because they just wanted to toy with the gamers about the whole idea of two brown hooded figures, right? You remember how there were two and you're like, oh, is it Joshua? Wait, why is Joshua casting a spell of death? You know, like the writers love that. There's brown hooded people in like so many Final Fantasies that are all these mysterious figures. So by delaying this reunion between Joshua and Clive, it allows them to have this big impactful reunion that you want so bad, right? Like halfway through the game, it's not in the beginning. And then it also allows them to kind of toy with the gamers. I don't think that they really thought through how they would need to justify Joshua staying away from Clive very much. I just think their focus was to make those two things happen. But in my personal opinion, I do think they should have fleshed out what would have kept Joshua away from Clive, given that he was as devoted to Clive as he seemed to be to his mission. It just felt weird that they wouldn't talk.
Let me drop a 10 or 15-second conspiracy theory in here.
Oh, no.
You know what would explain this?
What?
Episode Arden, episode Ignis, episode Gladius, episode DLC.
Okay, that's actually a good idea for DLC, is what happened between Phoenix Gate and this point. Okay, I think that would be a good piece of DLC content.
I feel like, so you got to remember, right? Every single gaming company, all of them, regardless of who they are, there's kind of like two halves to the brain. There's the creative folks who are doing all the game development, the story development, all that.
Right. And then there's the practical, pragmatic money people.
The bean counters in the suits, right? Who are like, how do we make money off this thing?
Right.
So my guess is that like the creative side of the house knew they had a home run on their hands at a certain point.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh yeah, we're getting the DLC. So they started saying, not only are we going to deliver the bomb on this one, when the DLC comes out, it's going to be unbelievable. Now, I'm setting everyone up for a massive deflation here, I know that, but that was like my conspiracy theory on this whole thing.
We get the DLC and it's like some side character that no one's ever heard of.
The Tonberries come back.
Oh, please no. That will not be fun DLC.
No.
So anyway, that was my second question. What's yours, Ernest?
That's a great one. I'm glad you had that one. All right. So speaking of kind of shady characters, right? The next one is, how did Barnabas know Ultima, and how did he become engrossed in this like cult, this religion of Ultima, right? And how was he able to use his powers over and over with seemingly no consequence?
Yeah, okay. There's a few questions in there. So I guess if I were to respond without having done a ton of thinking about this, so we know that the religion that worships Ultima is really old, still practiced religion on the continent of Waloed, right? That's something we know, which is why Joshua goes there with Clive and with Gav, is because Joshua wants to go to their temples and basically see if he can uncover anything he hasn't. Apparently, Waloed has been so isolated that their religion hasn't evolved much. So given that that's the case, it makes sense that people living in Waloed, especially somebody like Barnabas, who ends up apparently being the king.
Who wasn't from there.
He wasn't from there?
No, remember?
He's from the south, huh?
He was from some other place in this world that we don't even know about. And he came over as supposedly a young boy, but it had been, I don't remember the exact number, but it had been like hundreds or thousands of years. And obviously he's an adult now, but he's barely aged in like several human lifespans. And when he came over, he like took over the joint, basically.
Well, yeah, because he was a dominant, so he had all these powers that they hadn't seen for a while.
Barnabas was only a boy when he arrived from beyond the southern seas, and barely a man before he united the ragged tribes of Ash. And having unleashed them upon the formidable Veldemark, he set his throne upon the ancient kingdom's ruins.
And they said that even after that, they were concerned that like his bloodthirstiness was going to spread all over Valisthea. And he just didn't. He just stayed up in his tower of evil or whatever and just never came out until all of a sudden now he came out.
Well, that's an interesting question then, because I always thought he was from a different part of Waloed, like a different corner. But you're right. I think Vivian does say he's from somewhere else, which, by the way, the other continents thing, other than the twins and Waloed, that's a whole other question too. It's like, are there no mother crystals anywhere else? Were they all just in this one spot?
Right.
You know, do they have the blight? Do they have bearers? Do they have all this stuff? Or is it just like another planet on the same planet, right? So that's a good question, because there's a lot of questions around Odin. That'd be some good DLC content as well.
All I remember from Vivian was he shows up and he just takes over the place, like kills whoever and just takes it over. And now he's the king. And he's there for, I don't know if it's hundreds or thousands of years.
No, but Barnabas isn't like 1,000 years old.
That was my impression, that he was actually very old.
I don't think so.
More than a normal human lifespan would be.
Really? I didn't gather that. I'm going to go back and look.
Yeah.
If Odin is older than like a normal human lifespan, then that means there's a lot more questions.
That's actually what prompted my entire question was, he seemed to be able to use his powers with impunity, where everyone else suffered like some kind of cost or negative health issues or whatever,
Yeah.
he seemed to be able to.
Oh, you know what? He's Akashic the whole time, right?
I don't know.
Don't we realize that at the end? Like, and maybe Akashic just go on forever until they're destroyed, right? Because at the end,
I mean, it's possible.
he's Akashic and then he fades away to that kind of Akashic dust stuff. So
Right.
if what you're saying is true, that could be the cause of it. But then again, there's more mystery.
At long last, salvation. I'm coming home. Mother.
I guess I didn't have these questions because I just took it at face value that Odin worships Ultima. He has probably an interesting backstory, but it's not relevant enough for me to care too much. But now that you're saying these things, now I'm really curious.
Yeah, because remember, whenever he speaks about this stuff, he's like super into this cult, right? Like he's like trying to convince everybody to join this cult and just turn themselves over. And he keeps telling Clive stuff like, if you just let this happen, you will be the most powerful entity on the planet, and just like giving him all this stuff, which is, what exactly what a cult would say.
You must embrace the truth, Mythos. Accept your place with the Lord.
But the thing that caught my attention was that he was using these powers like all the time whenever we saw him, and not like little ones. Like he was transitioning back and forth between his icon and back with zero impact to his health or his stamina or anything.
Well, the first time he faces Clive, who's been like undefeated up until this point, he slices him to almost death, but purposefully leaves him alive with no problems at all. And it's like, oh, that was kind of a letdown. Clive, you suck.
He keeps telling him that it's because he's given himself to this
religion,
power.
this god.
Yeah, and my whole question about this was like, Ultima obviously shows up to a few other of these characters over time, and they seem to all pan him in one way or another. But why did Barnabas not, right? Why did he just give in? And then was Ultima somehow involved in his ability to be able to wield this power without any kind of consequence whatsoever?
Did you find anything on the internet?
So I found some stuff, but I don't know that it's helpful. Like I found this one thread on Reddit, and the guy says here, him being a religious zealot fits perfectly as an added dimension of the overall theme of free will in the game. The central conflict of the game is with being a slave and being a master. The literal take of this is seen in bearers and non-bearers, and then the wider scale of this is with Clive as Mythos being meant to be a slave for Ultima, or eventually his vessel, right?
Okay, I agree with that so far.
Yeah, what Barnabas adds, at least to me, this is this person writing this, right?
Yeah.
And how I saw it is the hypocrisy of the situation. He himself is a king who oversees the established rule of bearers and crystals, yet he himself is a slave, whether he knew it, accepted it, ignored it, or otherwise to Ultima. He accepted that he is nothing more than Ultima's plaything, and he was perfectly content with being that. I think the scene that people meme on a lot also adds something to why Barnabas reveres Ultima the way he does. Barnabas gets to see his mother even if it isn't real. That basic comfort was enough for him to sell himself over to Ultima, which ultimately led him to accepting a truth that he is just some slave Ultima and his race created. Granted, we only got a glimpse of why Barnabas and the rest of the Waloed revered Ultima, but that to me was enough to make him interesting. Is he the best? Not necessarily, but he's certainly not the worst. I didn't mind his fights as well.
Interesting. Okay, I like that answer. I think it's a really good answer. Whoever you are out in Reddit world, did you get their username?
Let's give him credit here. His name is Nathaniel, spelled with an E, Nathaniel with two L's on Reddit.
Nice. Bravo, Nathaniel.
And I kind of agreed with him a little bit in that there are plenty of people out there who are willing to sell their soul for that little bit of power that they'll have over somebody else.
Yep. Yeah,
it's all over the place.
Just
look around you; it's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
So this is like Barnabas obviously was a little boy when he came over to this island, and he was a dominant. And I'm guessing that that's when Ultima got him and said, "Hey, I will give you," similar to someone who promised someone else over the course of 40 days, starving and without water in a desert, "I will give you unbelievable power if you just submit to me." And Barnabas went for it because he was like, hey, that's better than what I got. And like this guy pointed out, he gets to see his mother, even though she's not real. So it's almost like Ultima's using the memory and like this false version of his mother to control Barnabas, which brings an entire other aspect of like a mama's boy and just
it makes you wonder so much, especially with that weird naked scene where it starts out as Benedikta, who then evolves into naked Kupka, who then evolves into Ultima, who I guess is naked. I don't know if he wears clothes, if his little shell thing is clothing. And then it goes into his mother, and it's like, what is happening?
There was all kinds of weird stuff.
And then they never answered that question. You're right. They never talk about like why he's got this mama issue.
And that's what I wanted to understand. Like, when did he make this decision that he was going to take Ultima's religion or whatever you want to call it? And then how did he end up in the position where he was just like using this without any kind of consequence? Like, did Ultima give him something? Or perhaps it was like Ultima showed him something like, hey, if you just do this when you're priming or whatever the case is, it prevents you from taking damage, so to speak, to your stamina. Like maybe there's some kind of like ancient technique or something that allows where these other dominants that are born with that power, it's not like they ever got training on how to be a dominant, right? They just discovered they had this power and they had to figure it out on their own. Ultima obviously created it, so he could tell Barnabas, yeah, here's how you're able to use the power without any kind of negative effect. And the trade-off is you give your soul to me. Maybe. I don't know.
That's an interesting question. That's given me a lot to think about and some things I'm going to go back and look at because now I'm super curious.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Not one of my questions either. So far, we haven't overlapped on any questions.
Wow, that's impressive. I thought we were going to have all the same ones.
I know. I thought so too. Okay, here's another one for you. You ready?
Yep.
What was the point of Oscar the Squire?
It is an honor to make your acquaintance, Lord Rossfield. I am Oscar. Oscar of House Murdoch.
Murdoch? I wasn't aware the Lord Commander had children.
Oh, he didn't. But his brother, my father, did. I am Sir Rodney's nephew.
Like, what was the point? Do you remember Oscar the Squire?
I remember Oscar. He's freaking awesome.
No, he's not awesome. He's almost awesome, and then he's not. Like, okay, he shows up twice. Once for an introduction, right, with Wade.
If it please you, my Lord Marquis, might you take me as your squire? I would learn the duties of a shield from the finest.
And then again, he shows up outside of Clive's room where he delivers the same exact monologue every time you talk to him, no matter the point in the story.
I will not forget this kindness, my lord. I shall go to Eastpool, but as soon as the rebuilding work is complete, I promise to return.
It seems to me like they set him up to be significant in some way, and then he just isn't. He's just this random guy with no closure. So I checked the interwebs. Well, do you have any opinions before I give you what the interweb said?
Not really, other than to say, like, there's a lot of these little bit characters like Oscar the Squire that I can think of. I don't remember their names, obviously, throughout the story, where it's like, they're very young and they're trying to get into either a trade or they're like apprentices, I guess in this case, a squire. And there's even a side quest about one of them that's trying to become a baker, right? But he's having a really hard time with it.
And there's another one trying to make the perfect
blade,
hunting knife or something.
Blade, right? Yeah. So you see these throughout the thing, and I feel like all of this somehow goes together. And all I can think of is like, these are just young people who are trying to move into a career, if you want to call it that. And they're super, what's the word?
Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
They're like excited. They really want to do this thing. And then like one of them like is super doubting himself. And it's like the older generation's job to kind of like shepherd these people along in the midst of like this global crisis that's happening on this planet at the same time. So I feel like they're almost comic relief because like they don't like these younger ones don't really realize how bad stuff really is.
Okay.
And I feel like they're thrown in there for the same reason that the baby is thrown in at the end of the game, to try to give people a sense of hope that like, here's these young, hopeful people trying to come up.
Okay.
It's like a future looking hopeful scenario rather than like the disaster that we're living through in this game.
So, okay, I can buy that. The only problem I have with it is that all those other side quests were resolved, right? They had closure. They had some kind of resolution. This one is just, it's like set up to start and then it never goes anywhere. So it feels very like a half cadence in music, right? You want it to resolve back to the tonic, but it doesn't.
I shall go to Eastport, but as soon as the rebuilding work is complete, I promise to return.
So what did the interwebs say?
So the interwebs, one person said, there was an Oscar in this story?
Oh, man, that's good.
To which I would say, exactly the problem, right?
Yes, he lives in a trash can. Okay.
Another person said, Oscar is a way to wrap up the Murdoch story in a happy way, showing that someone is going to live on to carry their name and legacy, because Oscar is, I think, a nephew of Lord Commander Murdoch.
Something like that.
Yeah. So, okay, that's fair enough. And then Kevin from the internet on Reddit said it well, I think. He said, this bothered me way more than it should have. I kept talking to him and he kept saying the same thing. And I was yelling at the screen for him to go to Eastpool. And I completely agree with Kevin, because he keeps talking about, like, if you talk to him outside of Clive's room, he says, oh, I really would like to help with like the rebuilding effort or something along those lines with Eastpool.
I heard about Eastpool, that some of my fellow guardians are to build a new home there, both for themselves and for Madame Martha's bearers.
And I think Clive actually encourages him to go. And he says, okay, thanks, Clive. I'm going to do that thing.
Go. Be with your aunt. Rebuild her home. Is what she would have wanted.
Yes, my lord. Thank you, my lord.
And then you go back there 10 hours later and you're in a way different part of the game. And he says the same dang thing.
I shall go to Eastpool, but as soon as the rebuilding work is complete, I promise to return.
It's like, dude, I was just like Kevin from the internet. I was like, go to Eastpool, you moron. Just go. Like, you're the worst squire ever. You haven't done anything squire-like at all. You just sit there and annoy me. Anyway, yes. So then Narcs, Naarcx from Reddit said, what if the DLC we get is just an Eastpool restoration project starring Oscar?
Wow, it would be like the Final Fantasy XVI version of Power Washing Simulator. You're just in there rebuilding Eastpool.
With Oscar.
Right?
Why not? Hey, it would give some closure, resolution, and point and purpose to his character. So if they do that, good on him.
I will not forget this kindness, my lord. I shall go to Eastpool.
So my opinion about this Oscar character here. So I think, honestly, I think that there must have been more originally planned for Oscar, but it ended up on the chopping block due to either time or budget. I really think this is a case of that.
Yeah.
He is such like an ellipses, like a ... of a character as it stands the way he is. Even after he's told to go clean up Eastpool, we never see him do it, which I don't think would have been that difficult, you know, even with like a little NPC in the background, because we go to Eastpool at other points of the game, right?
Several other times,
Yeah, so if he was intended to provide closure on the Murdoch story, as somebody suggested, I don't think that was successful because he's set up to play a role, but then he never actually fulfills that intent.
I agree.
And if the developers had to cut the rest of his story, I think they should have just cut out all of Oscar completely. He's such a question mark that I think leaving him in, I don't know, maybe the voice actor would have been sad or something. Like, I just feel like he was...
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you're saying, that they meant to do some more with him and then they couldn't. And maybe, because look, I've worked in software development all my life in some way, form, or fashion, even though I work on a different side of the house. But I'm going to guess that it was very difficult to retroactively go back and take him out of some of these larger scenes.
But he's only in 2 scenes.
I know.
He's an NPC. You could just pop him out of there. That's easy.
I mean, maybe, right? I don't know. I'm not a game developer, so I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt on that one. But
you're good at that.
I'm just going to say the same thing I said for the previous one, DLC. I think this is one where they left it to DLC. Like, I was thinking, what if Final Fantasy XVI could be the actual Final Fantasy? Meaning they just keep building on this world, keep releasing DLC. There's like this new genre of game where they release it and they just keep updating it over and over and changing things. And like the game is still there, but it's not an MMO per se. So like, in other words, this story would just go on forever and they would just keep adding new content to it. I feel like we're so close to that. Like 15, I think they were going to try, but they obviously just fell on their face on it. But I think 16, they got real close.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting idea. I just think then there should have been a lot of open-ended characters. And there was just one.
I feel like there were.
Him.
Like I feel like
But who else?
Well, I don't know. We have all these lingering questions, right? So I have some other ones.
Oh, okay. Maybe we should get to the next one. What is your next one?
My next one is, did Kihel live?
Oh, well, we talked about that for an entire episode, right?
Well, no, we didn't talk about it for an entire episode. 90% of that episode was, what was her purpose in the game?
Okay.
So this is like the lingering question. Did she live?
Okay.
What happened to her? And actually, I'm just going to bundle 3 together here.
Okay.
Did she live? Did Terence live? And did Dion live? And I realize those are 3 completely separate characters, but remember how they're tied together, right? In this game.
Okay.
I can accept that Dion died, right? Although I'm suspicious that he didn't, I can accept that he died. But what about Terence and Kihel? Those are 2 those were my next 2. Like, did they live? What happened to them?
So did Terence, who is Dion's boyfriend, live? Did Kihel, the potions girl, who we see 5 times in the game, live? And did Dion live? I would say yes, yes, no. But we don't have anything definitive really on their stories.
Right. And I can accept that.
Yeah. And the reason that I would say Dion died is because I think that his entire purpose, once he saw the devastation that he had caused in Twinside, was to atone for his sins by killing himself to save the greater good.
Yeah, his entire purpose was for us to love a character and then to kill him. That's what his purpose was.
Thank you, Japan. Yes.
Yeah.
So I think Dion's dead, right? I think he got his wish. He shoots lasers at Ultima or whatever that big spell was.
Mega Flare.
Was it Mega Flare? I thought it was more than that.
That's Bahamut's signature, I'm going to end the world spell.
Right. But then it turns into like Giga Flare and like Zeta Flare and stuff in the battle with the Phoenix and Ifrit. So it gets like even more intense and crazy than usual. But yeah, whatever that spell was. So he casts a spell. He buys Joshua and Clive some more time to be able to stand up and then go face Ultima without being killed beforehand. And so I think his is a self-sacrifice. As far as Terence and Kihel go, the reason I think they're alive is kind of a cop-out. So if you check the cast list that Vivian has of all the characters, it blackens them out whenever they die, right?
Right.
Now, I didn't know if this is, do we black out characters every time they die, whether we know it or not, or only when we see it as the gamer, right? So I tested that theory because there's a side quest where Theo dies. So the first time I played the game all the way through, Theo died, then he's blackened out on the cast list. The second time I played the game all the way through, I skipped every side quest on purpose, and then I checked to see if Theo died on the cast list when I hadn't actually played that part of the story and he was dead. So it had marked him dead without me seeing that happen.
It makes sense because the story is happening regardless of whether or not we're seeing.
Totally. So that makes sense. But then it also gives me kind of a cop-out way to check and see if Kihel and Terence live, at least right up until the final farewell scene. So you can go talk to Vivian right before then. And I did that because I was actually curious about Kihel, and she's alive on the cast list. So I would wager and say that from a pragmatic perspective, she's alive. Terence is probably alive. My guess is that Terence whisked Kihel away from Twinside because Twinside was in such ruin and despair at that point. And I don't know where they ended up. I think that would actually be really interesting to know. And without giving away what we talk about in our entire episode about the Potions Girl, there's some really interesting stuff that you came up with around Kihel's character that could also play into what happens to her in her future.
Right. I would be so depressed if the answer was
yes. Like she just explodes.
When the arc took off, she's just vaporized with everybody. I would be like, wow.
She's made into dust with the rest of the city. Yeah.
Although that would be so on brand for a JRPG too. Right. So like I say that full well knowing that's probably what happened. So anyway, the internet,
Yeah, what do they say?
The first one, this is about Kihel. This is Baithin, I think Baithin on Reddit says, I have hope that it is the opposite. And he's replying to someone who said, basically what we said, that a JRPG just destroys everybody. He says, so this person says, I have hope that it is the opposite, that Dion sent Terence there to find her specifically to give us the hope that he got her out of there in time. And then there were some responses to that. I hope this is the case. My only consolation about Dion's probable death was that at least Terence and the girl could survive. The thought that maybe they actually died and Dion would blame himself again is so upsetting. So that kind of implies that he survived, like Dion survived, and he's going to find out that he lost his boyfriend as well as this little girl he was trying to save, which sounds terrible. And then his like subnote is here, I don't know why they made it so hard to have even a sliver of hope or happiness in this game.
Amen to that. Okay, I agree. I won't go into it. Go watch our ending episode where Ernest and I disagree vehemently about these topics. Yes, I feel, who is that? Who said that?
So this response was somebody named Silent Study 7631 on Reddit.
Silent Study. I have so much empathy for your position on that. And every time I play Final Fantasy, I'm like, oh, maybe this is the game where I'm going to be happy in the end, and then it isn't, and I just want to punch everybody.
Right. So that's did Kihel live, right? And every single one of them was around the same thing, saying like they all hope she lived, but it's a JRPG. So then Terence, right? So some of the comments. So Pancho Hobo said, Pancho Hobo, that's his name on Reddit.
The names on Reddit are the best.
They're so awesome, right?
They're the best.
It says, nah, Terence was sent by Dion to set up their new home with their newly adopted medic girl. That's so awesome.
He thinks that Dion survives, gets back with Terence, and then they raise this potion.
Right. So apparently he sends Terence to save this girl and adopt her. And then Terence does the interior design, I'm guessing, for their new home so that when Dion gets back, they can just have their happy family. I actually like this idea. That's a great idea. And it says, I'd agree, but so this is Tickle Fart on Reddit. These people's names are crazy. I'm telling you. It says, I agree, but did you all see how J-Dog greeted Mid? I'm afraid he has his eyes on another.
Wait, J-Dog.
Josh.
Oh, Joshua. J-Dog greeted. Okay.
Yeah, because the original thread says the real reason that Dion sent Terence away, and it has a picture of Josh hugging Dion.
Okay, I love the gay community. Stop making all the characters in Final Fantasy gay. Ignis is straight. He's my Ignis. Don't make him gay. Joshua is straight. You got Dion. He's like the coolest guy in the whole game. Just be happy with that.
It says here, Dion is funny AF. When Mid tried to hug him, he had his hands out with an awkward expression.
Yeah, he was super awkwarded out. I don't think that's because he was gay, though.
And then the next one says, I will not stand for this slander. Terence and their daughter is waiting for Dion, right? So
okay.
That's kind of sad.
But that's like a reasonable hope.
Yeah, so there's like so much in here. But basically everybody was saying the same thing. That
Tickle farts.
I can't even read these things. But they're all kind of have the same idea, which is that Terence and Kihel survive and that they go off and have their life. Half of them said that Dion eventually rejoined him. The other half were like, no, he's dead. I don't know where to fall on that one. And then let me get the third and the last one for Dion. I think it says here, hundreds of balls. Okay. So that's his Reddit name. Says, yeah, but no way he is dead. And then Edgimus responds, it does feel like the writers intended for him to die, and it's a fitting closure for his arc, but it was left just open enough that he could be brought back if there's enough fan demand. I'm a fan demanding it.
Okay, who's that? Who said that one?
Edgimus.
Edgimus, I agree with you. That's a good comment.
And then this other guy called the Cimmerian says, I ask not for acceptance, only forgiveness, proceeds to laser the S out of God. Total baller.
I ask not for acceptance, only forgiveness!
And that's true. Like that was kind of my take on it too. Again, you know, you need to listen to our Dion episode, but I'm on the fence. I'm mostly in agreement that Dion died, but I want to believe that he didn't.
Yeah.
But what a way to go out if you did, right? Like you can't have a better ending than that. But I'm hoping that all three of them lived and they lived happily ever after. They had their little family.
That would be Super sweet.
But this is a JRPG. So we're meant to suffer.
Yeah, but remember, Xenoblade Chronicles, they end happy.
I know.
And they're so JRPG.
It's true. But it just feels like there are some JRPGs where they're happy. They're like joyous.
Yeah, that's not this.
And then there's Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
And it's like the only people that play this are people who hate themselves. Right? And it's one of those type of things.
Is that us? Is that us? Are we masochists? Are we sadists? Like, what is it?
I have more than one time in my life said people who play Final Fantasies are masochists because like if you played, I don't know about 14, but I played 11 for over 10 years. And I'll tell you the first couple of years, the first like 5 years were just brutal masochism, like nonstop grinding. It was horrendous and we loved it.
Yeah, I don't know though. Ernest, like I worked at Disneyland for years. I'm not exactly a masochist by what I can gather, you know?
Well, maybe that's the balance.
Maybe this is the way that I get like all my darkness out.
Yeah.
And, you know.
All right. So what's your next one?
Okay. My next question. Why was no one in the party afraid that Torgal would turn Akashic at the first crystal, Drake's head?
It's ether.
Then we better make this quick.
At this point in the game, we don't know about Torgal being some like fancy frost wolf who can turn into some magical creature and destroy everyone. Like we don't know that, right?
We don't know he's Fenrir.
Yeah, we don't know he's Fenrir. That's basically it. So even though we don't know that, later after the fact, when we find out about Torgal, it makes sense. Okay, that's obviously why he's not turned Akashic when he goes through all these ether floods, right? But that doesn't explain why Cid, Clive, and Jill weren't like, maybe we shouldn't bring Torgal with us into the crystal ether flood.
Breathe deep of the blessing, my friends. Who said being a dominant doesn't have its benefits?
They never explained that. So I remember when we went into the ether flood at the first crystal, I was actually really concerned for Torgal because we knew that dominants are more resistant to ether floods, but they said nothing about Torgal. In fact, they alluded to the fact that animals and beasts of all kinds are susceptible to ether floods, some more than others. There's some bits in there about chocobos being slightly more resistant because I think they wanted to explain why you could ride your chocobo through an ether flood and not have it change into an Akashic chocobo.
Did you know that chocobos are far more resilient to the effects of ether than most other beasts?
But we know that chocobos also turn Akashic because we fight them in the game, right?
Yeah, I think you just found an inconsistency where the writers knew ahead of time that he was Fenrir, and they just didn't realize where in the timeline this scene dropped.
Yeah.
That's one theory. My other theory is that they were already in too deep, like when the ether flood thing, and they couldn't back out. Like no matter what, he was going to have to go through it. I don't know. I don't remember the scene itself.
I think he could have just turned around, to be honest.
My guess is it's literally just that the writers, like they knew, but they didn't think about the order of events.
That's exactly what I think it was. But it was so concerning to me in my first playthrough of the game that I was on the internet trying to find the answer, like, because I was worried that there was going to be a scene where suddenly Torgal dies or something or turns Akashic because nobody thought to be concerned for his safety once they went to the ether flood. And I can't, like, you can't handle, like, okay, you can't kill babies and kids and you can't kill dogs. Like,
right.
That is too much. They already kill way too many people in Final Fantasies as it is. They kill the heroes, which I also don't think they should kill as many heroes as they do, but that's, you know, neither here nor there. So I was actually worried that they were going to kill the dog.
Yeah, so this did not concern me at all. This is the first time I've even thought about it. But I think the reason it didn't concern me at all, and I told you this, the minute I saw Torgal all grown up,
you knew he was Fenrir.
I knew he was Fenrir.
I didn't make that connection.
I think in the back of my mind, I knew he was Fenrir from that point, and it just never crossed my mind that, you know, hey, Fenrir will be fine in this. And of course, they didn't reveal it till later. But I just like the minute I saw his face and how big he was, I was like, oh, this is Fenrir. This has to be Fenrir.
How did you connect the dots with Fenrir? Because I know that Fenrir was a summon in Final Fantasy IX. He's a dog, a hound who...
And in 11.
Oh, he's in 11 too. Okay, he's also, he's a mount, and I think also something that you fight in 14, but I have not fought him that I can remember. So it might be some...
It was a combination of the size of him, like compared to a regular dog, like he was massive.
Big.
And then his coloring.
Yeah.
His coloring was like Fenrir, right? So when I saw, like, had he been a black dog, it never would have occurred to me.
Right.
Or a brown dog. But when I saw his coloring and he looked like a wolf and he was huge, I was like, oh, that's Fenrir.
That makes total sense. So here's what the internet tells me. Somebody said the game states that many animals are not affected by ether, the same as humans, citing birds don't ever turn Akashic. I don't remember them saying birds never turn Akashic, but maybe that explains why you see birds flying around everywhere.
Right.
If anybody knows where that point in the game is, please tell me, because I could not find it. Unless they were talking about chocobos.
Well, is it because they can fly above the ether flood? So they,
I don't know.
yeah, who knows?
And pretty much every other animal, any beast turns Akashic. We fight all of them in Akashic forms.
Didn't we fight an Akashic Moorball too?
Yes, right before Drake's breath.
So even that toxic waste dump turned Akashic. So like, what hope does a bird have?
It's turned.
Nothing a shield of Rosaria can't handle.
Then there were many other comments that state that his powers as a frost wolf would prevent him from turning Akashic. And yes, I agree with that. Like, that explains why he didn't.
But you didn't know it.
But that doesn't explain why Cid and Clive and Jill aren't concerned that he will. So I know it's like, seems like a small thing, but it was important enough and jumped out enough at me in the first gameplay that it actually distraught me. And I had to look online to see if he survived for the whole game as a spoiler, because I could not handle the dog dying in Final Fantasy.
That totally makes sense, right? If you didn't link him to Fenrir right away, then you wouldn't know, right? And you would think, oh man, this is the end of this dog,
That's
right?
what I was thinking. But you saw ahead. But what other question do you have?
Oh, so the next one, actually, I'm just going to lump two together. Did Clive live and did Josh live? And I know we talked about it, so why don't you give your kind of theory on it?
So before we did our ending episode, I was 100%, they both died. 100%. And then after not just having that conversation with you, but then thinking about it after the conversation, it does make sense that Joshua may have survived, that he may have resurrected. Because I wanted him to resurrect when Clive heals his body. That was like the pinnacle scene I wanted to see. I wanted that reunion, but I didn't get it. So I was kind of miffed, or at least depressed, which you can see in our other discussion. But you do bring up a good point that the after credit scene shows the book, Final Fantasy, and the author is Joshua, right?
Mm-hmm.
When did you write that? There's no writing that is happening throughout the game that we know of. Like in 14, there's writing happening constantly. You see it, you hear the voiceover, like you know it's happening. In this game, you don't see it, and then there's that book. So maybe they did actually resurrect the Phoenix, as the Phoenix should resurrect, right? Because that's the whole idea behind the Phoenix. But if that's the case, I think we should have seen it. I really wanted to see it in that last scene with him and Joshua. Like that first reunion where they come together in Twin Sight is amazing, but how much more awesome would it have been if he was brought back to life in that moment in front of Clive? Like, oh, so good. It'd be so good. But no.
That would have been pretty powerful. Yeah, so I'm on the fence if either of them died. I feel like Joshua lived, and I also feel like Clive lived at the end. Obviously, we won't know till the DLC comes out, right? How that panned out. But
DLC has a lot of questions to answer. It's going to need like 12 episodes of DLC.
Yeah, this is as literal as you can possibly take this. So take this with a grain of salt. But Josh was the Phoenix.
Yep.
And at the end of the game, he was down. He was the Phoenix down. Right? So the way Phoenix down works.
Phoenix down.
It's like an auto re-res, right?
Phoenix down.
So it's almost like he was waiting for the auto re-res and it happened later. Like it happened out of frame. We didn't see it. That's my hope, right?
Yeah, but what a missed opportunity.
And the reason I feel that way is because, again, this is a JRPG. And it's like Joshua gave his life for his brother, but really for all of humanity, because he knew that his brother needed that power to save the world. Wouldn't it be fitting that Clive gave his life for his brother back?
Yes,
right?
It would.
And then he died. So that's like the biggest reason I'm pretty sure that Joshua lived, but also kind of plays out a non-erotic Romeo and Juliet type thing where like one thought the other one was dead. So they tried to off themselves. And then it turns out the other one had just taken a nightshade. And
yeah, but neither of them died purposefully.
They both died purposefully. However,
kind of.
Joshua ends up rising because he's a Phoenix. That's on brand for a Phoenix. That fits, right?
It is on brand for a Phoenix. I just wanted to see it.
He's able to self-resurrect himself, right?
Yep.
So I believe that for sure Joshua survived. I'm like 90% sure. Clive, I'm kind of 50-50 on.
Yeah.
I want to believe he survived for only one reason.
Uh-oh.
Because he told Jill that he was going to come back.
I'll be back. I promise.
And if you make a promise like that and you don't keep it, you're going to hell. So I don't want to believe that Clive is in hell. So I think he lived.
Yeah, I don't know. They could honestly go either way with either of those characters. My biggest beef is not 100% on whether they lived or died, but the fact that we didn't get to see if they lived.
DLC.
Right. That's my biggest beef. They can't make a DLC that's just as long as the original game unless they're going to do like sequels like they did with 13, which out of all the games to have all the sequels, 13.
Yeah, 13 was like, I hate to talk bad about these things, but like 13 is just, it just wasn't my cup of tea or any of the sequels to it.
Yeah.
I played through it and I don't remember any of it. What I do remember is I didn't like it and I'm not going to play it again.
Lassie, Falsey, what are they talking about? I was so confused.
Yeah, it was just too weird and like the story was awkward and it just gave me like this Libyan terrorist vibe.
Some really bad voice acting and some really good voice acting all in the same game.
The graphics were actually decent, right? Like,
right, yeah, it was beautiful.
For that series.
Very beautifully
so
made.
Yeah, it just fell flat at the end of the day. Like the story fell flat, I think is what
totally.
It came down to.
So they made 2 sequels.
Now, I say that I have had it happen before, believe it or not, where I've played a game and said to myself, man, this was not a good game. I don't like it. And then for some reason or random whatever, played it again years later and my opinion changed. I've also had it happen where I've played a game and thought, man, this is the greatest game ever. This is awesome. Play it 5-10 years later and go, what was I thinking? This game was terrible. So
yeah,
I could play 13 again and say, wow, this is actually a great game, right? Because the world changes and something might change my opinion of it. But anyway, what are the other ones that you had?
Okay, this is a big question for me. And my guess is you'll probably be pretty forgiving of the writers again, because you're just so nice and forgiving, Ernest, of these writers. And I'm a little harsher on them. But
it's a hard job.
It is a hard job, but it's the easiest job to get right up front, right? Like it's the least expensive to make changes to. So I'm like, just get it right and then go into production. Don't go into production until you got the script right.
But how many poorly written movies and TV series and everything have we seen? It seems like
a lot.
The number of people who get it right is not the majority.
I totally agree with that. And the writers, to their credit, I need to give the writers credit. They got a lot of stuff right in 16, like lots and lots of things.
A lot.
There was better writing in this game than any Final Fantasy I think I've played up to this point by quite a bit.
I think 6 was better.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was like, if I'm confused, then there's something wrong with the writing. And in 13, I was confused the entire time I was playing the game, even while I was researching things on the internet, because Reddit was also confused. So everybody's confused, that's a fail.
Yeah, see, I always take the opposite approach. If I walk out of something confused, I'm like, what the hell did I miss?
Oh, I think that too. But then when I realize I didn't miss anything, then it's bad writing, right? Because I'm totally vulnerable to missing something. That's for sure. I'm the person who has to click on Tome's little guides as I'm going through cutscenes to make sure that I'm getting everybody straight and like understanding what the political stuff that's happening is going on. That's totally me. But I actually do all that research. And if I'm still confused, then I start to point the finger at the writing.
It makes sense. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So this question is, why did Joshua choose to cage Ultima in his chest, of all places? And I couldn't find any answers on this. Do you have any, Ernest? I could have missed something.
Wow. So I remember thinking about it when it happened and also thinking like, why did he put him in his chest? And the only thing I could come up with was there was a scene somewhere where someone said something to the effect of, at least at that time, we can't kill him, but we don't have to destroy him to like essentially take him out of the equation.
That's an argument for caging Ultima.
For caging him, right? But where else are you going to cage a god?
I don't know. It's a Final Fantasy. Couldn't you put him in a crystal or something? Like there's a lot of things.
Well, they tried that with Bahamut in Final Fantasy XIV the first time, and you saw what happened at the end of that, right? So the only thing I could think of was that Joshua had figured out that he could in fact trap him in this phoenix feather cage, right? But I don't think it's something he could keep externally just running, or however you want to look at it, like energized in perpetuity, because it required his power to do that.
Okay.
And the only way he could do this successfully was to internalize him to where he was inside of him, and then he wasn't using his external powers that would like drained him into a rock or whatever, happened to them.
With every setting sun, I feel my strength wane. And though the Phoenix's flames mend the prison I have made for Ultima, they do so at a cost.
And that's just a suspicion.
Okay, that does address the first part of this. Because my thought is, wasn't there like a less risky place to cage Ultima? Like, did he have to put Ultima next to a vital organ in his body? Was that the only place that Ultima could go? Like, to me, if that's the case, I would have loved to see that spelled out and at least have the audience learn why that's the case. Like, I wanted to see it or hear it or something.
Oh, well, that's obvious. It's because, again, he had to power this cage, and the only place where the flames of the Phoenix burn forever are in your heart.
Okay. Wait, you mean like that?
Oh, you got it.
That stupid slogan of the Undying. What is it? May the fires of the Phoenix burn forever in your heart.
May the Pontiac Thunderbird roar forever in your heart, or whatever. Yeah, I don't know.
May the Firebird's flame burn ever in your heart.
But if you take it literally,
that's true.
Maybe that's the reason.
Maybe.
I'm just saying.
Okay. So if I were to give you that, which is hilarious, my second point on this is caging Ultima next to his vital organ didn't stop Ultima from doing anything he wouldn't have done anyway, right? So he still pursued Clive throughout the game because there were multiples of them, which means that only one was in Joshua's chest, whether that be one of his race or one of Ultima, like part of like one section.
One piece of the puzzle that he needed to complete the thing at the end.
True.
At least that.
Yeah, but he doesn't prevent him because even when Ultima at the end needs that piece, he just breaks free and he goes to Ultima. It didn't help at all.
Oh yeah, because at that point Joshua had been weakened to the point where Ultima was able to bust out of the cage.
Maybe, but to me, I just saw it as like, this is not the wisest place to put Ultima, for one. And then by the end of the game, I just thought, did this help at all? You just died. Like to me, it didn't work because I didn't have answers, I didn't have background, and I didn't see a point or a purpose to the decision. So at the end, I was just kind of like, well, that was kind of dumb. I mean, don't get me wrong, the death scene was amazing. So well done in so many ways.
Well, Ultima did tell him, like, thank you for bringing back what did he tell him? My brother or my...
I think he does call him his brother or something like that.
Welcome home, brother.
Thank you for bringing back the other thing that's in your chest is basically what it came down to. And then he took it back. But again, at that point, Joshua was so weak. Because remember, up until that, like right before that scene happened, for, I don't know, like maybe a scene or two, Joshua was telling Clive, I can't hold him much longer.
So then why did Joshua go with Clive and Dion then? If he knew he was did he know he's bringing that final piece of Ultima to Ultima? Like if Joshua would have stayed behind, would he have actually prevented Ultima from being made whole?
No, so I think that's part of the problem is in order for Clive to win, it had to be Ifrit risen. So it had to be Joshua and Clive, the combined powers. And I think Joshua had already figured that out. And so he knew he had to go, but I don't think he realized.
But it's not Ifrit risen that kills Ultima. It's just Clive.
Yeah. But I'm saying like Ifrit risen is the one that battles with Ultima risen. Like it's the counterbalance to his icon.
So your argument is then Ultima would have prevailed in that one battle and they never would have made it to further battles.
He would have prevailed and then probably come after Joshua anyway, right?
Okay.
So I think that Joshua had figured that part out because I don't think he knew until that last scene where he saw all of them around the chamber that he was like, uh-oh, like it's not just one. This isn't actually him. This is a piece. And that's why Ultima was like, thank you for bringing,
Okay.
Because obviously, if Joshua had known that part, I don't think he could have done anything differently, honestly, but he would have realized that what he did was in vain. Maybe. There's also the other side of it that maybe caging a piece of him allowed them to have enough time to prepare for this final thing rather than Ultima being able to like assemble all of his little pieces ahead of time, right? Who knows?
Maybe, but we never see him assemble pieces beforehand anyway. They all kind of get together at the end.
We see it at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, so... Maybe. Okay. Well, those are some feasible explanations. So then I guess I would say it would have been nice to see this if those are the reasons, nice to see that fleshed out more so that people understand that's what's going on. Because even thinking about it, it just made me feel like the writers wanted a self-sacrifice in Joshua, and they wanted these like big moments where Clive mourned his loss, which were great moments, but the way they got there to me just wasn't terribly effective, at least not as much as it could have been. And it just made him look like he didn't quite think things through very well. Even though his motivations were noble, it made me think that there were nobler alternatives that would have kept him alive to maybe help Clive further in those final battles.
I think this one is a tough one for the writers. And of course, you already said I was going to be gracious to them, but
I'm sure they appreciate it though.
I think this was a tough one for them because think about it. Put yourself in the place of the writer. Like, you know what this ending is going to be, and you know there's going to be all these Ultimas around the room, and they're all going to kind of come together and then do like this Swan Lake dance and, you know, all this other stuff, right? So,
which was really cool, by the way, that dancing part. I thought that was awesome.
Yeah, so you know all this stuff is going to happen, right? So how do you write this part of the story without giving away what's going to happen in the end? Like, how do you set it up?
It's possible.
I'm sure it's possible, but I'm just like wondering, how do you do it?
One simple way that they could have done something about the hole next to the vital organ in his chest is to put something in Yote and Joshua's conversation when they're resting on the side of the road, where they talk about, you know, you know, why it's there. They don't talk about it.
Isn't there a phrase for that though? Like when you tell something like in dialogue rather than show it, or
it's exposition.
I don't know, but it's usually frowned upon. I'm clearly not a screenwriter, so you know, don't fault me here. But I also think that part of what happened here was when Joshua did imprison him in his chest, he thought he was actually imprisoning Ultima, not a piece of Ultima.
I agree with that. I think that's actually why.
Like, he didn't realize.
I think that's fair.
He thought he was locking down the whole thing. And then he realized at that last part of the game, oh crap, like I only got a piece of this guy, right? But I also feel like in that ending set of scenes, although they didn't explicitly say it, I also feel like they alluded to the fact that Ultima actually couldn't complete his thing unless he had that piece back, right? So I think it was like a combination of telling a story of like Ultima is ultimately the grand puppeteer, or he orchestrated this whole thing to get his other piece back. But you're right. You really have to dig to explain this, right? So it could have been made clearer. I guess I figured that's exactly how he was going to die. He was going to suck it right out of his chest. I didn't know for sure up until that end point.
I didn't think that.
Just playing all these stupid JRPGs like all the time, especially the Final Fantasies. It's like, look, I know where this is going.
You think you know me?
I guess my final point before we go into your next question is I don't love on-the-nose dialogue either. I like dialogue where there's a lot of good subtext and they're not actually just saying what they feel flat on the nose, right? But I would prefer a few lines of on-the-nose dialogue to no dialogue about something and then ambiguity and confusion in the story. So like, it's more of a, if I had to pick one over the other, I'd take a few lines of the on-the-nose dialogue rather than the ambiguity, because I was confused at the end. But you did bring up some good points, and maybe that's probably what the writers were going for. I just didn't get the sense, at least on the first playthrough, and not as much on the second either.
And there were definitely things that I like also was like, I have no idea what's going on here. And I had to go back and like try to figure it out, but you're right. So the last one I have, it's a bit of a combination question, and I could not find a Reddit thread for this at all. So this is entirely our opinions.
Oh.
So it's, what happened to everyone in the hideaway after the ending? What happened like a week out from an ending, a month out, a year, 5, 10 years, 50 years? Like, obviously we get that credit scene that looks like it's, I don't know, 1,000 years in the future.
A long time later, yeah.
A long time to where all this stuff is fantasy,
Legend.
right? Or myth.
Mm-hmm.
But what immediately happened in the aftermath of this thing? And I guess like from that point forward up until, let's say, the current cast of characters basically died, right? Like, what happened? Obviously, once they die, then this thing turns into myth. But I'm curious as to like what happened to them. We saw the farewell scene, and then we saw Clive on a beach, and then that was it.
Yep.
And you're left with an impression of what you think is going to happen. But then you have this credit scene, and you're like, oh, that's a little bit different than what I thought. But it also sort of aligns with it. So what are your thoughts? Like, what do you think happened like in the immediate aftermath? And then just say until like, who was the youngest one of that group?
Mid, probably.
The baby that was born.
Or the baby that was born, yeah. So
until that thing died.
Okay, that thing. That baby. That human being.
Like, yes, it's a baby, but it's a plot piece, right? It's the story. So
it's pixels, really. So
and it looked like an alien.
Yeah, not as bad as little baby Joshua did.
Not as bad as little baby Joshua.
He
That's
looked
true.
like an alien more.
Aren't you the most beautiful thing? He is, isn't he?
So, okay, before I go into what I think probably would have happened, I will preface this by saying this was my biggest problem with the ending. And you can go back and you can see me expound on this in our other discussion. But my problem is that at the end of the game, not only do they kill off the heroes, at least we think they did, or we're not really sure, which I have issues with, and I wanted some heroes to live, right? The biggest problem I have beyond that is that we don't get to see the fruits of their labor. We don't get to see resolution in what happens after the fact. We don't get to see the world being rebuilt and reborn and, you know, the politics settling down and people figuring out how to live peaceful, meaningful lives after Clive and Joshua and Dion sacrifice, because that, to me, makes their sacrifice worth it. So if you're going to let those characters die at the end or allude to the fact that they may have died, I want to see that resolution, which is exactly the question that you're asking. I had the same question. I was like, what happened? So the best I can think of in my own mind is I assume that the characters that we've been with spend their time rebuilding this world. And it's all about that at this point. So, you know, at first it was just a little rebuild East Pool effort.
So you're saying that Oscar finally gets his day.
Oscar gets his DLC. Right. So we get to see the world being rebuilt, probably even by Oscar. And maybe that's what they cut. Maybe he was meant to have like something in the end. I think it was a huge mistake not to show any of that. But yeah, I imagine Jill alludes to the fact that she wants to go to other continents and spend time. I imagine she probably helps with some efforts, but then takes time with Torgal to go travel and just find peace in her life, right? That's what I would assume. You could say Joshua resurrects and writes the book, or maybe he doesn't. I don't know. I think everybody in the hideaway probably expands their reach to outside the hideaway to be the entire continent of the twins, maybe even allude to rebuild. Gav probably has a big hand in that. Otto probably has a big hand in that. Maybe Karen opens a shop, you know, like that kind of stuff. And then I would think that it's revealed that the baby was born not as a bearer, because it's assumed when we meet Etta, the pregnant woman, that that baby is a bearer because she's the only one who seems to be protected from turning Akashic, which makes us think, oh, she's got resistance, which could be from the baby, right? But then maybe because Clive's sacrifice happens and the crystal maybe was destroyed before the baby comes out of the womb or something, maybe that baby isn't a bearer. Maybe there's no more magic on the earth, right? So everybody's building things with their hands. So you could go into specifications as to how each character helps with that rebuilding effort, but I would say Jill probably goes on a mission of peace and self-serenity. Everybody else rebuilds until everything becomes legend and we see that cute little scene at the end of the credits that to me just wasn't enough payoff for this entire 80-hour journey that I just went on.
Yeah, exactly.
But, you know, again, I don't want to, I feel bad being so negative on it, but the ending was my biggest problem with the game. That said, still an incredibly amazing game, and I had a great time. And I appreciate so many aspects of it. So I don't want to leave it on a, ew, I hate this because the ending sucked. The ending did kind of suck to me, but that doesn't mean that the game is bad. No game is perfect.
Yeah, I feel like they had a choice when they got to the end of it, right? We can either assume that this thing is probably going to flop. So we kind of give it a hard ending. And then if it succeeds, we're trapped. We can't do anything with it. Or we give it an ending that like leaves some open questions so that a portion of the user base is happy.
But like whether or not main characters survive, that's pretty open.
Well, I think everyone in the hideaway survives. I think that's a given.
Yeah.
Right. But you're right. But like some of those main characters that, you know, yeah.
Like that's a little too much to leave open.
I feel like a lot of this that we're pointing out here is due to two things. One of them you've mentioned many times is they had this grand plan, but they didn't have the budget and the time to pull it off. I think that's part of it because I think that happens
often
in many things.
I think it's possible.
But I think the second thing is that they didn't know what the outcome of this thing was going to be based on like what happened with 15 and some other things. And so they tried to toe that line where they could still make DLC or maybe a 16-2 or something, however you want to look at it, because they left enough ambiguity or open-endedness. But if it did flop, there was enough there to like close the story if you just made your own assumptions. And I know that that's like kind of not a cop-out, but that's like a poor way to end a game. But I think that's really what it came down to is like there was hope on many levels. They ran out of time, they ran out of budget, and they didn't know how it was going to perform.
But even if it performs subpar, wouldn't it make sense to give closure and close it off? Because to me, DLC should only enhance what the full story is. It shouldn't add story points because then it's not DLC. It's, oh, we didn't.
I think that's true. And part of me thinks I'm giving a little bit too much credit in some areas because one of the biggest complaints I've had over the last maybe decade of gaming, not even related to Final Fantasy, is just a lot of these developers are being strong-armed by the publishers to release games that aren't actually finished yet.
Well, that's what happened with 15 in spades.
And so DLC is not what we would traditionally think of as DLC. DLC is what should have been there initially, but wasn't because the publisher forced them to do all this. And so I feel like with JRPGs, it's a little bit different. And with Square Enix is a little bit different because they will take years and years and years to make a game. So I don't feel like they were rushed, but I think it was one of those things where like there is a hard stop. There is a certain point where like the suits are going to tell you, hey, you got to cut it right here. Whatever you got, that's what we're shipping, right? Mm-hmm. So tie it up as best you can and get it out the door.
But it was obviously somebody's decision to kill Clive and Joshua and Dion, or at least supposedly. Yeah. Like that was a deliberate decision. And I think like if you're anticipating that your cutoff for budget and timing is this line, right, that's coming up or a long time in the future, then you need to prioritize things like the ending to do that up front and first, right? And then cut back on like the side quests. It's like Oscar, you know? So maybe Oscar was a victim of that. But to me, there's no excuse for chopping one of the most important things, which is resolution and payoff for the person who's dedicated, 80 hours to actually seeing how the story ends. So while I agree with you, I just don't think they intended to put that in, which I'm not happy about, right? Like that's what makes me sad and bummed out.
It's hard for me to say because I feel like in these type of games, they do the ending first.
Yeah, usually, right?
And then they go back to the beginning. But you remember that 15 kind of had the same situation, right? Where like...
But 15 tried to be open world, and they weren't ready for open world, and it ended up being such a time suck, right? So that makes sense.
I feel like this is what happened, that like there was a lot more story before the ending that got cut that would have explained a lot more about where the ending finally got to.
That's fair. Like maybe they had to strip out anything that wasn't deemed essential, and maybe even some things that were deemed essential.
Right.
But I just think that one of the most essential things is that...
But they didn't cut Oscar.
Conclusion, so, but they didn't cut Oscar.
Whoever voice acted Oscar is going to be so pissed at this episode.
No, he knows. He's probably laughing with the rest of us. Like, oh my gosh, I'm Oscar.
Yeah, he's like, yeah, man, I got like 2 scenes. Hell, Oscar the Grouch got a better career than I did. But no, I agree. I feel like they did definitely cut some stuff that even if it wasn't necessary, it was clarifying. It was a direct contribution to understanding. Mm-hmm. That got cut. And then I think there were other things like, for example, the Oscar thing, they were probably a significant thing that got cut with him. And so like what got released was, I mean, you've seen these things where like there's been movies where these actors and actresses go in, they record all these scenes and like they think they got a pretty big part of the movie. And then when the final cut hits the theater, like they've got one scene.
Yeah.
And they're like, what happened?
Yeah. I used to work in Hollywood. I used to do that, like cut out huge parts. And sometimes you do it for story. Sometimes you do it for tone. Sometimes you do it for timing, total runtime. And other times you do it for performance. Right. Like sometimes the actor is just worse than you thought they'd be. So you take them out as much as possible. There's a lot of reasons to do that, but that's not the reason to cut an ending,
Yeah. So it didn't end the best it could have. That's for sure. But I'm almost willing to bet if you talk to one of these writers, like off the record, they'd be like, yeah, we had a lot more and it got cut.
They signed all the NDAs. There's no way.
Like, I don't know what happened here with the hideaway after this, but I agree with you. I think what happened is they all went and kind of did their own thing and tried to make the best of, because remember, it was supposed to be like a lot worse for a while before it got better. So they tried to make the best of what they could. And then eventually they died. The next generation took over. And then fast forward, I don't know, 1,000 years, you get the credit scene. Everybody's happy, but they're living like they're in the Stone Age. And that's it. Perhaps the whole point of this game was to tell people to move back to a much simpler life.
Possibly. I think there's an argument that could be made for that.
I will not forget this kindness, my lord. I shall go to his...
So another quick question. There's a side quest called Silver Linings where Clive ventures to Rosaria to track down a silver chocobo feather. Do you remember that?
Right. Yep, sure do.
And my question was, why doesn't he just whistle and take a chocobo feather from Ambrosia? She's a chocobo that's silver. Like,
that's a good point.
You know, and when I looked...
She's white, isn't she?
She's silver. She's considered a silver chocobo, just like the other ones. She's the same color. So I did some research. A lot of people had the same question. And the conclusion that I think I agree with is that the developers just didn't really think about the order in which people would be completing the side quests. And it was probably just a mistake in sloppy writing or something, you know? So
yeah, makes sense.
And that's a small thing that you don't want to fault anybody for. My other questions are, I'll just read the questions really quick since I know we got to go. We've had a good discussion here. Jill and others make references to other continents. So my question was, did those other continents have blight or bears and magic, or were they just like natural, normal continents since they didn't have mother crystals, right? Because the only mother crystals that existed were the ones that we took care of. So that was a question I had. I also have questions about the broken statue of Ifrit that's found in the interdimensional rift. This is one that might be worth going into. So I didn't know, was that like the original body of Ultima or something? Because he does say something about like casting off his body. So does his spirit or his soul look like the ugly dude with 4 arms? And he really is supposed to look like Ifrit? Like, same question with the Ifrit statues all around the Nexus, right? Like, I didn't know what was going on there. And I thought that the publication Dual Shockers actually had the most interesting answer in their article entitled, Who is Ifrit? By Joshua Leeds. He says, near the end of the game, Clive and Joshua come across a creature that looks like Ifrit but is long dead and turning to ash. So that's the one I'm talking about. Ultima, in his most powerful form, is also a figure resembling Ifrit and reveals that Ifrit is the true form of Ultima and those like him. As Clive was Mythos, or a new perfect vessel for Ultima, he was given the ability to take a form much like that of Ultima's true form to steal other icons' powers to prepare the form for Ultima. That makes sense to me, but I would also say at the same time, like, that didn't make sense to me in the game, so I would have loved more around that. And then this article went on to say, well, Ifrit is the icon of fire. That is primarily due to his connection with the Phoenix. Through Clive's blessing of the Phoenix, his Ifrit was given fire and became a second icon of fire, while also having the ability to take and use other elements. If Clive was born into a different family or received a different icon's blessing, it's possible he would have taken that icon's element instead of fire. I mean, we all know Ifrit is the dominant of fire in every Final Fantasy game, but I guess that could be true for this one.
That one actually kind of makes sense because we talked about it in a different episode, but remember I had kind of this theory because Ultima referred to Origin as his arc.
Right.
And that these were actually like
aliens,
a race of aliens that had come to Earth. So it makes sense that their forms would be very different, right? Because of wherever they came from.
But why would he look like he's a 4-armed, weird, corpsey human instead of Ifrit? Like, why would he change into that form?
Yeah, so I don't know why he would change into that form or whatever. The only thing I can think of is there is a precedent in like a lot of historical religious things where they talk about these gods and goddesses, especially in ancient Greek and Roman mythology, taking the form of humans, right, to interact with them because either they don't want to scare the humans because they have such a drastically different form, or they want to gain the trust of them. So they take the human form because they're a god, they can do that. And that's how they choose to interact with humans rather than show up in their natural God state. So it kind of makes sense.
But then did Ultima just do a really crappy job? Because he does not look like a human. He just looks like a weird four-armed, creepy corpse. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
well, I'm certain that's not what it started as. That's what he ended up. I don't know. It's just one of these things where like it makes sense that the version that he shows up as is humanoid as opposed to being like a kaiju.
Okay.
It would make sense if he's trying to interact with humans. But you're right, like having 4 arms, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, I thought that explanation of Ifrit opened my eyes a little bit, but I do have to say I agree with this comment from Bu Kojiro on Reddit. Bu Kojiro,
Awesome
I
names.
guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This person said, I'm more wondering why that was left up to the viewer interpretation since they went and directly explained so many other things. Like that would have been a pretty important detail to throw into the exposition dump, I think. That should have been what Joshua explained to Clive about his final realization about the mural, but instead he just waxes poetic about the power of human faith. I agree with that. Because it's okay to have that fantastical story, but if it's not communicated to the audience, then we just end up being confused, and confusion and ambiguity, I will always say, is the enemy of storytelling. And so I would have just liked to see that, even, like he says, thrown in the exposition, even if it's got to be on the nose dialogue, right? It's better than not having anything at all.
Yeah, even if you had like found it in a book somewhere or in an inscription on a wall.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Something.
Anything, right? Something that you have to hunt for in a side quest that's like, you know.
DLC.
Yeah, or one of the many DLCs. And then my other questions were around what's with the multiple Ultimas? Is that like different brothers, like literal other beings of the same race, or are those like clones of Ultima, or are those parts of Ultima? And the basic consensus online tends to be around the popular theory of hive mind you're probably familiar with in science fiction, right? Which means like a unified consciousness.
And not just science fiction, a very specific part of science fiction known as the Borg.
Really? See, I don't know. Like, what is the Borg?
They're a hive mind. That's why you see the green light behind me.
Yeah.
The Borg Collective.
So is that a Star Trek thing?
Yeah, it's like the historical enemy of the Federation is this hive mind that goes around assimilating other races to become a perfect race.
Yeah, well then I'm talking to the expert here.
You're familiar with this life form?
Yes. My people encountered them a century ago. They destroyed our cities, scattered my people throughout the galaxy. They're called the Borg. Protect yourself, Captain, or they'll destroy you.
So that's kind of the idea that they're thinking about this multiple pieces of Ultimas, that it's like a hive mind kind of thing. The only aspect of Final Fantasy that I can think of that mirrors that idea is there is a race called the Nath of beastmen that also have kind of a hive mind idea in Final Fantasy XIV.
I still feel like it's a race of aliens that have come because
you've convinced me of the alien thing. I'm on board.
When he refers to the thing as his ark and the fact that they tried this and he calls them his brothers and sisters, to me, it indicates there are multiple. Now, keep in mind, the Borg is not one person. The Borg is a race of all different species that are connected together in one hive mind.
Okay, that's the same as the Nath, except they're the same species. But yeah, they're separate individuals.
And there's a queen, right? So that makes sense. Like it could easily be that this is a race of aliens that are in fact a hive mind.
And then Ultima, like the Ultima is the queen kind of?
Ultimate is like their queen or their king or whatever of the hive, right?
Okay.
Because somebody ultimately has to make decisions, right? That could make sense. But again, I don't know about that part of it. The only thing is his speaking, using terms like ark and the fact that this happened on another planet and then they came over here, which means they're a spacefaring civilization, right?
Yeah.
So in Star Trek, there's plenty of episodes where alien species do some like what we would consider terrible things. And then we find out it's because they're the last remnants of their species that's about to go extinct.
Oh, and they're desperate.
And they're desperate, right? And not that that makes it right, but that's just what's happening. And so this is why you remember episode Arden for 15, right? This would be the ultimate, pardon the pun, the ultimate DLC here is to find out that in fact, Ultima and his brothers and sisters are in fact the last remnants of an alien species that is all but extinct. And this is their last chance
at survival
to not go extinct as a species. And Clive squashes them like a bug. Like, that would be the ultimate.
That would be worthwhile.
DLC right there.
I'm really excited to see what comes out.
Because that's kind of like what happened with Arden.
Yes.
Right? Like, this whole time you're like, oh, who's this, arrogant, just evil dude? And then you find out, oh, wow, this guy got screwed. Like,
yes,
you feel bad for him, and like, you should never feel bad for a villain.
No, you should. It makes it so much better when you do.
Right. And it kind of reminds me of Walter White from Breaking Bad. Like, they start out that series where you build all this empathy for him, and then he turns into like this gangster drug dealer, and you're actually cheering for him to do horrible things because of the fact that he was being discarded by society. And this is like his last chance, and he makes this pivot, and you're like, yes. And then you realize, like, I'm cheering for a criminal. What the hell is wrong with me? Right? So like, this would be a great, like, writers, if you haven't done the DLC yet, you can send me a check.
That would be really interesting DLC. I totally agree with you. So maybe we'll find out the official answer, but I think your description is pretty spot on. Other couple quick questions. I had a question around, why is there a second brown hooded figure who is apparently Ultima, who just looks exactly like Joshua? And honestly, I'm convinced that this is the answer. Somebody called Bass GSD, or maybe Base GSD, BASS, depending on how you read the word, on Reddit said, in universe, it's a coincidence. In reality, it's an attempt at misdirecting the player before the reveal that Joshua survived. I think it's as simple as that.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. You're always going to see like these weird things that they're purposeful red herrings.
Totally. And there are a lot of hooded figures across Final Fantasies. We see a ton of them in
the Tonberries.
Final Fantasy VII Remake. Yeah, the Tonberries. Oh, those things are terrifying. You see them in Final Fantasy XIV. Like, there's an entire character, Grahatia in Final Fantasy XIV is hooded until like quite a bit of the story is done, and then you find out who he actually is.
Could you imagine if they had a scene where somebody saw the hooded figure and they try to attack it and it's a Tonberry?
Oh my gosh.
Everybody would be like, oh, this guy's about to get it. Like, because the Tonberry is going to tear you up. You know how that's going to end.
Oh my gosh. That's like a horror movie. Like pulling a hood down on some figure, and
you just see their
scarier
beady
than
eyes.
Ultima. Just like having like a freaky Tonberry. Oh my gosh.
I'm much more scared of a Tonberry than I am of Ultima.
Yeah,
for sure.
For real. Oh, I'm with you. Especially after Final Fantasy 13. They're cute, right? But I was so mad. I could not defeat them for the longest time. And anyway, whatever. We could talk about Tonberries forever. But then my last question, and this is one that I know you would have an opinion about, is did we ever find out why Anabella wanted to kill all the bearers?
This was my mother's doing.
But why? Why would anyone...
I don't know. I never truly understood her. But this...
Oh, Clive.
I will learn what madness drives her, and I will end it.
Wade speculates that it's so her new son might not have anyone to challenge him.
Her obsession with bearers only seems to have grown. As to why, I don't know. Maybe she can't bear the thought of anyone having the power to challenge her beloved son.
But since when did a bearer ever really try to do that? You know, and then people on the internet just think she did it out of hatred or out of boredom. But in the game, the way it's written, I just don't think that hatred is enough, or at least not expressed enough for me, because even characters like Clive and like Wade express how they don't understand her motivations. So they pose the question to the audience basically over and over again, but then it never really seems like it's answered.
You mean my mother? But it doesn't make sense, even knowing what I know about her.
In a historical context, right? If you look at it today, we cannot understand how Germany in 1939 went the direction it did, right? Like, it just doesn't make sense to us, right? So
it's very hard to compute.
The same thing is happening in this game, but at the end of the day,
but it happened.
Autocrats are autocrats, and whenever they feel their power is slipping, or the reverse, they actually need to gain power, They need a scapegoat. They need a common enemy. They need something to unite their faction against to consolidate their power, right? So like someone said, they're doing it so her son doesn't get a challenger. I think the two are actually related.
Okay.
It's not just that she doesn't want her son to have a challenger, but also if the potential challenger is of a specific race and she can turn everyone against them, she gets two birds with one stone. Right?
See.
Like she unites her factions against a common enemy, gives the people something to go after that ultimately results in the safety of her son's power. Right? So it's like a twofer, in other words. So the two actually, I think, go well together. There is one character in all of Final Fantasy who I could think would do what she did because he was bored or thought it was funny.
I know who you're going to say.
Yeah. Only one, and she's not him, right? So this is not that. This is literally nothing more than an autocrat trying to preserve her and by proxy her son's rule, right? That's what this is about. This has nothing to do with what Kefka did in 6. Like that guy was mental. Like that's a different level of evil. That is like you have a malfunction in your brain and your basic brain chemistry, right? Like that's not the same as this. She is like the perfect example of a human that wants power at all costs. Kefka is the example of somebody who is mentally ill, doing things that an evil person would do because of that illness that they have. It's not about power. It's about insanity. There's the difference there.
I tend to agree with your ideas and your conclusions and your theories. My issues are more around why wasn't it made clear in the game, right? So
yeah,
from a writer's perspective on this Anabella thing, I mean, if they literally draw attention to this question in such a deliberate way out loud multiple times, but then they don't provide an answer in as clear of a manner. And so to me, if you're going to draw attention to a question, you should answer it without just this whole one note, Anabella is bad kind of a thing. But
yeah, I think with the Anabella character, because of the historical analog, it was more of a cultural sensitivity thing that they didn't take it all the way.
That's fair.
Now, had they gone on the nose, I think it would have created
some issues,
a backlash, right?
Yeah.
Putting this in modern historical context is very difficult, right? It's a very sensitive topic. So they had to be careful.
But they left so much slavery content in there, and that's a super sensitive subject.
Right. That's super sensitive, but I don't think we're ever at risk of that coming back in modern Western society. Let me put it that way, because it clearly exists in other parts of the world. However, we're seeing anti-Semitism in modern Western society on the rise again.
I don't understand it.
After we thought it had been done away with at the end of World War II. So the clues are right in front of you if you want to see them, of who the most modern historical analog is of this character. And that's a sensitive topic, especially today.
Okay, I can understand that. That's pretty much all the main questions we didn't overlap for a single
at all
question. They were all...
I'm shocked.
I thought for sure we'd have at least half of them overlapping.
Yeah, I see this happen all the time because I see YouTubers do this stuff all the time where it's you pick your top 10 and I pick my top 10 and we're not going to tell each other. And then they come and a good chunk of them overlap.
Yeah, but ours didn't overlap at all.
That means our audience had 18 completely different unanswered lingering questions.
And it's interesting though, as we've been talking about this, while I had a number of questions, and while some of those questions were not a big deal, and other ones I thought were kind of major and should have been answered by the storytelling, right? I will still say that this Final Fantasy stands above most other ones in terms of making the most sense. It actually had a lot less plot holes than other Final Fantasies. And I love the Final Fantasy series, even the ones with huge holes in them. I loved aspects of them, right? I admittedly left some of those games pretty confused at the ending. I think a good example of that is Final Fantasy XIII, right? With the whole lassie and all of that. Who knows what that was. But here, there were a lot of great tools to help me grasp what was going on with the story and the characters along the way. We've talked about it, Tomes, Vivian, all of that. the way that you could actually pause a cutscene and read about the very things that they were talking about during that cutscene, right?
Well, that was super appreciated, the pausing in the cutscenes.
Yes.
I can't tell you how many times I used that.
I did too, because they'd only mention a name once and then,
Right.
who is that? And then you could go and actually read about it. Super, super helpful. So all of those things help answer so many questions. But this is an 80-hour game. It makes sense that I missed some things. It also makes sense that there were some open-ended questions at the end. So I would say, even though I didn't love some of those unanswered questions, I still give kudos to the developers. I still give kudos to the writers for giving us these tools to help make it easier, and also just writing a really good game. Really, really fun game. I think the series is on track to be less confusing than it's been in the past. With each installment, it seems to get better and better, right? Like 7 Remake,
Yeah.
I know you haven't played 7 Remake yet. That's on your list of things to do.
I played a little bit of it, but I don't think I even made it a quarter of the way through.
Gotcha. Well, it's also pretty clear. Like, the storytelling is very good. A lot of the same successes in 16 it had in Remake, although 16 is on a new level with voice acting and some other things
Right.
as well. And 7 Remake is trying to retell a story that they told once before, so
Right.
they could have learned, what worked, what didn't work, what they need to flesh out more, and what, they don't.
And that's what I appreciate about 16 is that it is what I would call a game that was designed and written with lenticular design, right? There's multiple lenses you can look at it through. Because I play a lot of JRPGs. There are so many out there that it's like, it starts off the same thing. Someone wakes up with amnesia. They don't know who they are. Then they team up with a bunch of other random people. There's some evil person in the world and they go kill them, right? Like there's just so many of those.
Was there an amnesia character in 16? I don't think there was.
I don't think there was.
There always is.
Well, that's my point. Like, there's so many of these. There's so many of these, right? And don't get me wrong, I like those too because I like JRPGs. But the thing is, with this one, like, I appreciate the fact that it was designed lenticularly, if that's even a word, in that there are multiple lenses, right, that you can look at this through. And if you want to go deep, right, and start pulling in historical analogs, it's there, right? But if you don't,
And a lot of people do, like going through these Reddit threads.
yeah, but if you don't, you could just take it at the surface level. It's a really good time, and then
You move on.
You're good. Or you could go find something to obsess about and get stuck on that all day. Like, there's multiple levels of this stuff in this game, so I appreciate that they put that in here.
Totally.
And I am anxious to go finish 7 Remake because I know that the other one comes out. What is it, February or?
It's coming up. We're going to have to
Awakens,
talk
or
about
what is
that
it?
too. Rebirth.
So I got to go hurry up and do 7 Remake before Rebirth comes out so I can make sure that I'm.
You might want to do Crisis Core as well.
Here's my thing. The writers did such a good job that it is hard for me to believe that they screwed up some things royally. It is a lot easier for me to believe that stuff just got left on the cutting room floor because of budgets and timelines. And I'm hoping that they're going to get their chance with the DLC or whatever comes next to tell the rest of their story, right? And finish it out. Because I think they can. And of course, we heard from Yoshi P, right, that they're going to do it. We just don't know what they're going to do, but they're going to do something. So I'm like, please give us more. Like, this is one that I feel like there's a lot more you can give here. So give it to us. Like, we like it. We obviously bought this thing. We're willing to pay for it.
You want to play it?
Yeah. Like, just give it to us because we're asking for it.
I guess we'll see. It's going to be an exciting ride.
I've accepted at this point that Final Fantasy is no longer a turn-based RPG.
Yeah, it's evolved out of
Right?
that.
Like I started with. And I've accepted it and I'm fine with it moving forward. 16 is really good on the combat. The other thing I think that got left on the chopping room floor was the chocobo riding controls.
Oh, the chocobo?
Those things are terrible. Like, that thing is like driving, I don't even know what. It's like trying to drive a tank while you're under the influence of alcohol.
Oh no.
Right? Like that.
Yeah, it's like the
that
way it
bad.
swerves and stuff like that. I didn't ride the chocobo very often. Like, I did every now and then on my second gameplay.
I rode it all the time. The minute I got it, I rode that thing all the time.
I just would run.
Even to the point where it would like tell me, oh, you can't call it here. And I'm like, what do you mean I can't call it here? I would get mad about it, right? And it all goes back to the fact that MMOs, right? Nowadays they call them a mount.
Right.
But if you didn't have something to ride on. It took you forever to get from one zone to another.
Oh, yeah. No, I love collecting mounts in 14.
And that's actually the biggest reason I was so depressed when we didn't get the airship, because I thought, man, this thing, I'm going to be able to fly across the map. And then they denied us that. So
yeah, but you don't need to fly across a map when you can just click where you're going to go, right?
I know, but I really did like flying that airship around.
Fair enough.
So I hope they bring it back.
I guess we'll find out. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Final Fantasy Files. If you enjoyed what you heard, of course, subscribe to us where you get your podcasts, including on YouTube, where you can see the video version of what we're talking about, which includes a bunch of footage from the game that we're referencing along the way.
And don't forget to rate us 5 stars on all your favorite podcast platforms, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
It really does make a difference. And it's no easy feat to create these episodes, but totally worth it and lots of fun for us. And we'd love to hear your comments.
Right, your comments. And you can visit us at finalfantasyfiles.com.
And with that, walk tall, my friends.
Right. May the roaring of the Firebird echo ever in your heart. The Pontiac Firebird. Pontiac Firebird, okay?
The ending of our conversations is truly my favorite because I never know how you're going to say that.
Who knows? Because I don't know what it is. Like, I know it's roughly something about
the
flames of the Firebird and burning in your heart. I know it's that.
Oh, man. We'll get it right before we conclude all these.
Every time the guy kept saying that, I was like, I'm just going to take a Prilosec and then I don't have any heartburn. But I don't know.